All right, boom and bust cycles. This is where we've got really close connections in population size between a prey organism and a predator organism. Okay. And they make perfect sense as you look at this. If we look at this graph, the snowshoe hare and the lynx, right? The snowshoe hare gets eaten by the lynx and so on. When snowshoe hare populations are high, so when this red bar is really high on the graph, the lynx have an abundance of food available. And so we start seeing that their populations increase. But as we get more and more lynx in the population, they eat more and more snowshoe hares. So the snowshoe hare population starts to decline. And without the food available, the lynx population declines. Now that we don't have as many lynx, the snowshoe hare can start to increase. And as they increase, the lynx population follows. And so we get these cycles that are slightly offset from one another of increases and decreases within these populations of snowshoe hare and lynx. And we see this with a lot of different organisms that their populations are very closely tied to one another. Okay. And so we can look at reproductive strategies that different organisms will take to make sure that they can produce as much offspring that will survive into adulthood as possible, right? Because that's the whole idea behind natural selection is that you make babies and then those babies can make babies. We want those genes to get passed on. So we've got our selected species here, things like mice, quick development, they reproduce young, have lots of typically a lot of breeding episodes, um, a lot of young per breeding episode. They don't put a lot of investment into their young, high mortality rate, shorter lifespan. Okay, so what does all of this mean? Mice develop very quickly. Okay, so a mouse becomes an adult in the span of weeks to maybe a couple of months, and then they can start breeding that young. Mice can produce multiple litters a year, okay, making lots of babies. Now, they don't spend a lot of time and energy raising their young. They get them to a point where they can survive on their own, and then boom, they're out. And the reason for this is because most of those mice will not survive to adulthood, whether it be because of food availability, disease, or predators. A lot of them will die. And so the R selected species strategy looks at producing as many babies as possible so that some of them make it to adulthood, right? You've got a greater probability of some making it to adulthood and breeding if you make a lot of babies. And so the video down here looks at mice specifically as R selected species and how absolutely out of control it can get because of how quickly and how often they can breed. Okay. The flip side of this are K selected species. These organisms take longer to develop. They reproduce later in life. Okay. They'll probably have multiple breeding episodes, but each time they're not producing a lot of young, maybe one or two, but they are investing in all of those young that they have, spending years sometimes. Okay. They don't die as often. They've got longer lifespans. So the example here, the elephant, long life, they can live 80 or so years. They're reproducing, producing just one young typically at a time, but they're raising those youngs for multiple years. Okay, investing in them to make sure that they can make it to adulthood. Okay, we look at primates. Okay, let's talk about orangutans. After orangutans are born, which is usually one or two per breeding episode, they will spend up to 10 years with their mother. And so we've got lots of investment here to make sure that these few offspring that they have make it to adulthood and then can reproduce themselves. Okay. And so in R selected, real quick, as many as possible so that some can survive. K selected, just a few, lots of investment to make sure that they survive. Okay. So a couple of different strategies here. Okay. Again, So our population growth rate, how quickly these populations can increase, is dependent on the patterns of reproduction. So our selected species can increase their populations extremely quickly. Okay, cockroaches, bacteria, fish, mice, insects, all of these things can just explode in population because they have this R selected strategy. So usually a lot of the offspring will die, but if they don't, we can get these huge increases in population. These are cockroaches in this image. This isn't real. This is an art installation, but they can certainly get to this point and rather quickly. Okay. Fewer offspring that live longer are K-selected species, humans, bears, bald eagle. These populations, when they increase, are going to be slower. Now, as we'll look with humans, we've actually done this relatively quickly in the grand scheme of things. Okay, and this is where we'll start looking specifically at human populations. Okay, so we turned from hunting and gathering to agriculture. About 8,000 BC, many places independently around the world started domesticating crops and animals and growing food in one place. So we now had this food that was available all of the time. We started to see some population increases because of this. Okay. And you can look at this graph here where we're growing and growing through those 8,000 years. Huge dip here from the bubonic plague that killed somewhere between a third and a half of all of Europe. Pretty bad disease. And then we see this explosion in population over a short period of time. Part of this due to the industrial and medical revolution. Basically, what we see here, a lot of fewer people were dying. We kept people alive longer. Babies that were dying beforehand lived. Food was much more available due to this industrialization. And then also, we see the Green Revolution, where we're able to produce more food, even with using less area. And so, we're increasing this carrying capacity for humans so that we can sustain this 7.7 billion people alive today. Right? And so, again, this industrial revolution is really where we saw this jumpstart in the huge increase in the human population. Okay? It's the industrial revolution. And so, this is just that same graphic here. There's an estimated 5 million people in 8,000 BC. At about 1850, we hit a billion. And then in the span of 80 years, we added another billion. Okay. In the span of 30 more years, another billion. 15 years, another billion. And we see this pattern. And then we hit to about 12 years for each additional billion. So this explosive exponential growth in the human population over the last 200-ish years. Okay. Carrying capacity of humans, how high can it go? How many can we sustain? I encourage you to watch this video here on YouTube. Very interesting on how we got to 7 billion in the advancements that happened to get to this point. Okay. When we look at populations, especially human populations, we look at age pyramids, and this can give us an idea of birth rates, death rates, and then also what's going to happen with that population moving into the future. Okay. So developed and developing nations have slightly different age structure diagrams. And so here we see a developed nation where it's mostly straight up, a little bit of tapering off down at the end. And so these populations are not growing. Okay. So we've got our older individuals, post-reproductive or reproductive individuals in orange, and then in green are pre-reproductive. Okay. Here in our developing nations, broad pre-reproductive, this means growth. We're going to add a lot of individuals when we have a lot of pre-reproductive and reproductive individuals because they're the ones that are going to be producing offspring, adding to the population. Okay. And so we will jump in here at age pyramids, jumping back in the next video.